Great to have you on the show, Michelle.
Thanks, Alina.
My pleasure. Oh, what a voice, eh? You must be very proud.
Very proud, and I'm very biased.
Well, yes, you would be, wouldn't you? That's understandable. So let's go back then. He was an ex-bus driver. He had no musical experience, and yet he went on to sell in excess of 100 million records. How did that happen?
Well, it's a very long story, but the reason, I mean, he came from a very impoverished background, one of 5 children. His father died when he was only 3, and his mother, who was struggling to clothe, feed and house 5 children, went into a sanitarium because she suffered a breakdown. So Dad was put into a foster home. So you can understand the displacement, and his escape was music. And what he used to do, he used to go around the pubs in the East End of London in the evening and offer to get up with the trio, and then they'd pass the hat around for him at the end of the night. And that gave him literally just enough to survive. It carried on. I mean, there was no sort of way out, you know, the war was going on or just coming to an end, and their home had been bombed out several times. So he signed up for the army, and he entered the talent contest there and won it an unprecedented 7 times. And the organisers said, "We can't let you enter anymore."
It's not fair on everybody else.
It's going to look thick. So they gave him his own radio show called Terry Parsons Sings, because that was his birth name.
Oh, right,
and
okay.
That's how it kind of all started. That was the kind of start of it.
So his real name is Terry Parsons?
Terence Edward Parsons.
Ah, brilliant.
The boy from Shoreditch.
And yet
he was a true East Ender, born within the sound of Bow Bells.
Oh, wow. Did he ever have singing lessons? Because he sings beautifully.
No, he never did. He went to a very eminent music academy coach and said, you know, here I am. And the guy said to him, yours is a gift, he said, from God. And he said, you know, don't mess with it, look after it. So Dad didn't presume to argue.
Wow, wow.
I mean, because his breath control and his diction were sublime. They really were. He used to go under the water in the local bars and hold his breath underwater. And he said it was to make his lungs stronger. And when I listen to some of these long notes that he does effortlessly, I don't doubt it.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. You can tell it does sound like he's had professional singing lessons. It really does. Incredible.
Yeah, never did.
Incredible voice. And what else was incredible as well that shocked me, amazingly, because we know a lot of his songs, he never actually had a number 1 in the UK, yet he had number 1s everywhere else in the world.
He did. Well, funny enough, 18 years after he passed away, I had found... Dad was a big movie buff from cine films, and there were canisters in the garage, and they'd been there, as I say, 18 years, cobwebs in the damp, spiders everywhere, and a company came and said, could we make a documentary? They didn't have a lot of money, so the deal was that, yes, I'd do it for whatever money they offered, but also that they would transfer all my old media to new media. And I gave them the canisters, among other things. And then I got a garbled phone call about a week later. He was so excited, he could hardly get the words out, that this was a full-length concert. And it was completely untainted. So they brought it out. It went straight to number 1 in the DVD charts, knocking Eminem off, which my son thought was the coolest thing in the world. So he actually has had a number 1 now, but
right, good.
He wasn't here to see it.
Good. Oh, he got it posthumously.
Exactly. But no, I mean, you're quite right. Most countries in the world he was number 1 at. I mean, in the Philippines, he would be 5 placements in the charts. At the same time, he was incredibly popular there.
For some reason, I'm enormously successful in the Far East. Why, I don't know. We have hit records. For instance, in the Philippines, I hate to say this, but in the Philippines, my record of My Way was the hit.
Is that right?
Yes, it's weird. Yeah, believe it or not.
Yeah, speaking of different parts of the world, you played Jakarta, you were talking about.
That's right, I was there at Christmas.
For Christmas. Yeah. This is a great story, only for the fact that, when you're an American, you're living in the U.S., all these names and far reaches of the earth are you know, are somewhat romantic, but with Jakarta, what was it like?
Jakarta is not the greatest place in the world to go to, but the people are nice, you know, and it's quite incredible because you go there and you think, Christmas and New Year, so what sort of audience are we going to have? And they say, oh, it will be local people, you know, Indonesian people. And it's rather frightening until you get out there and you realise that they know all the hit records anyway, which is the reason you're there in the first place, of course, you know. And we played for the 8 days, and I don't think there was a Western face in the audience ever. And we sold out for the week. It was marvellous. We had a great time.
How?
But Indonesia itself don't get me wrong, Indonesia is a very beautiful country.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's strange that in his home country it didn't happen until like you say recently.
No, he got to number 2 and stuff, but you know, it just didn't happen. It was one of those things.
And what about Born Free though, Michelle? Because the song actually got an Oscar, didn't it? But not him.
No, and it doesn't happen like that. The artist doesn't get that credit, if you like. But you know that never nearly happened because when they were John Barry, John Black, and my dad were in the studios writing this song, and the producer didn't like it. He wanted it to be about cages and, you know, lions being feral, and he said this was too much of a freedom theme. But John Barry threatened to walk out, and so did Daddy, so he backed down. Anyway, at the premiere, Daddy arrived, went in, no music. And the producer said to him in the foyer, oh, yeah, sorry, he said, but the canister got fractured in transport. Well, that was a direct lie. He'd had it taken out in the cutting room because he didn't think it fitted. But unbeknown to him, in America, Roger Williams had a number 1 hit with it as a piano instrumental. It was number 1 in the charts.
Wow.
So Screen Gems, the movie people, said, you put that back in. Because in order for a record or a song to be eligible for an Oscar, it has to feature in every single celluloid clip.
Right,
so
good.
It cost them a fortune to recall it all and put it back in.
Oh, what a shame.
So yeah, it won 2 Oscars for John Barry and for John Black. So, you know, yes, musical history could have been quite different.
Yeah, definitely. And didn't he also do a James Bond theme song as well?
He didn't just do it, he was the first.
Was he the first one? Russia with Love, from Russia with Love?
Russia with Love was the second Bond movie.
Right.
But the first, Dr. No, only had an instrumental.
Ah, OK,
and
got you.
Broccoli and Saltzman decided they wanted to have a singer. And so it was Dad and John Barry again, and they went in, and he became, you know, the first singer to sing and start a tradition that literally still carries on today. And he was very proud of it as well, because, I mean, apart from being a massive movie buff, you don't know it at the time, but in later years, when it became a tradition, you know, you think, and it's always voted in the top 5 or 6 of the best Bond songs ever.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know.
I can see
And
why.
it's a great song. You see, he did the Italian Job as well, and the Snow Geese and Quilla Memorandum. There are quite a lot of movies, but the top 3, which obviously is Born Free and From Russia and the Italian Job, enabled Dad to work everywhere. So he was propelled from being just a British singer to being a worldwide performer.
From Russia with Love, you also did the voice.
Soundtrack in the film, yeah.
Yeah, and that was, gee whiz, that was one of the big hits as far as
It
films
was
are
enormous,
concerned. Big money maker and all that. And then Born Free, of course. You know, the great thing about a singer like you, Matt, is that your voice and your fame goes international. Not all American stars have that. You not only have your popularity here, but abroad as well. So that means you can work that much longer and more and make that much more money.
That's true.
And he also did the Eurovision Song Contest, didn't he, in '64?
He did, yes, and his song, I Love the Little Things, came in a respectable second. But the song he really loved was the Austrian entry called Warum na Warum, which was written by Udo Jürgens and performed on the night by him. But it didn't come anywhere, wasn't even placed almost. And Dad went up to Udo and said, you know, I love that theme, you know, that just the musicality of it. And he said, can I take it back to England and have it translated? And it became walk away.
Of course, yes, of course.
So he won in one way.
Yeah, yes, definitely. I agree with that. So what was he like as a person, Michelle? I mean, I'm sure when he was doing his music, he was away touring, you probably didn't see as much of him as you'd like to have done. But what was he like as a man, as a dad?
Hey, listen, he was my knight in shining armour, and I know it sounds awfully like, oh, God.
Not
but
at all.
It's true. He was fantastic. And funny enough, when I wrote the book on his life and did 2 years of research, because I wasn't born until Dad was 30, so there was sort of a whole life I didn't really know too much about. I interviewed people he was evacuated with in the army, and I'd said to my mum, I'm not writing a fairy tale. If you want me to write this book, it's warts and all. And, you know, I couldn't get any dirt on him, and I don't mean in a scandalous way. You know, nothing negative whatsoever. Everybody said, oh, he's a lovely guy. He's a great guy.
Lovely.
Bruce Forsyth said, oh, he's like a brother to me. He was genuinely loved in the business, not just by his fans, but by other artists, you know. So it was incredible. I was quite knocked out by that.
Yeah,
I mean, I knew he was nice, but then, as you say, you could be putting on a facade. But he never changed. He never forgot his roots. He didn't put on airs and graces. He hated show business parties and these sort of chin wags. Wasn't for him. He went to a gig with the Sid Lawrence Orchestra and arrived for rehearsals, and Sid Lawrence's manager was in the dressing room having fish and chips. And Dad went, oh, where's that from? So he went round the corner to get his own, and these two women in there nearly passed out.
No.
You know, they couldn't believe it was him. But he would never have asked anyone to get it for him.
He didn't have to be humble as well. I was reading about some of the greats. I mean, even Frank Sinatra said that if he had to choose three of the finest male vocalists in the singing business, Matt Monro would be one of them. Wow.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because Sammy Davis, who was a very good friend of Dad, he was interviewed in America to start with, and he said, who's your favourite singer? And without batting an eyelid, he said, Matt Monro. And the reporter said, well, what about Sinatra? He said, well, what about him?
Who?
And I loved that, you know. And in fact, they did a show. Sammy was working in Vegas, and Dad was there as his guest, and we were watching the show, and he suddenly said to the audience, one of the greatest singers in the world, he said, come on, Matt, get up and sing a few. And they literally tore the place apart for the rest of the night. It was fantastic.
Oh.
I wish that somebody taped it. But no, I mean, he was called, he had the nickname the Singer.
Yeah.
Because singers would come and hear him work.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
I mean, he was always stunned by the fact that other people would want to meet him. That, you know, he didn't just revere people, they also revered him and wanted to pay their respects, you know. He was literally an East Ender that had a beautiful voice.
There could never be a portrait of my love, for nobody could paint a dream. You will never see a portrait of my love, for miracles are never seen. Anyone who sees her soon forgets the Mona Lisa. It would take, I know, a Michelangelo, and he would need the glow of dawn that paints the sky above to try and paint a portrait of my love.
Michelle Monro is the daughter of much-loved singer Matt Monro. She's the author of the internationally best-selling biography of his life, The Singer's Singer, and she released a brand new album of her father's work, Stranger in Paradise, The Lost New York Sessions, in 2020, which went straight to the number 8 spot in the official album charts. And she's with us here just now. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Toby, thanks.
So we'll talk about the book in a second, but first of all, your father, Matt Monro, was he already famous before you were born, or was that something that sort of came about later?
I was very little, you know. I mean, he'd been struggling for a lot of years. He didn't actually make it till he was about 30, so, you know, I was very little, and I wasn't sort of aware at, you know, the first few years of my life what was going on, and I didn't realise that other parents didn't travel all the time, or, you know, didn't have people at the house all the time and interviews and all that. To me, it was a normal life. I didn't know any different.
And at what point did you realise that that wasn't normal?
Well, the first oddity was when Dad was in the Eurovision Song Contest, and we were watching it at home. My mum and my brother had just been born, so it's 1964. And I couldn't understand why Dad was in the room, so to speak, but not there. And I left the room in disgust, apparently, because I didn't get it at all. And then the very first time I saw him live, it was, I was like, oh, these people are applauding. He hadn't even opened his mouth. He'd only walked on the stage. And I'm like, wow, what's going on? It was surreal, really. And, you know, something I grew to get used to in one way. But I mean, you know, for all the perks and nice homes, holidays you have, you know, Dad was away 9 months of every year, all the missed birthdays and special events, the school, you know, sports days and things he's not there for. So that was very difficult.
And what is the main memory that you have of him?
He was just a great guy. I loved him, dear, and he still do. And he was my knight in shining armour. Yeah. You know, I was his princess. I'm the only girl. So, it was a special relationship. And we moved to Florida in 1980. And my dad and I used to go out every morning about 7 or 8 and play around a golf. And my mum called herself a golf widow, but we were home by midday usually, so she was fine with that. But those were special times, you know. It's just unfortunate that when he had, was earning sufficient money, if you like, to take it a little easier and spend more time is when he was taken away, sadly. But that's the irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
He was only 54, you know, so it's no age.
But of course, he had a prolific career in his life. He was the first person to actually sing a Bond theme.
Yeah, well, that was great. I mean, you know, my dad loved the movies anyway, I mean, especially spy movies. And when he was asked to do it, it wasn't the first Bond movie, but the first was Dr. No, but it only had an instrumental. So he was asked to do this. Of course, he didn't know he was going to set a precedent that still exists today. So, yes, he was the very first.
Yeah.
And it often comes up in the charts of the best of Bond, that he's still in the top 10, you know, which is great. Fabulous, really.
Yeah. And I suppose at that time, it was only the second Bond film. So did he realise how much of a big thing it would be?
Well, he didn't at the time. I mean, you couldn't predict the phenomenon that the Bond would become. I mean, with Dad, Bond and the Beatles, they were the 3 biggest exports England had in the 60s. It was incredible. And also, you see, he did Born Free, the movie, which was global, as was The Italian Job on Days Like These. And that's what propelled him from being a British singer to an international artist, because those films went worldwide. And suddenly he was in demand everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of interesting that perhaps his arguably 3 biggest songs are from movies, but he's a lot more than that, isn't he, really?
Yeah, but I mean, you know, he had Walk Away, Softly As I Leave You. There are the big hits. It's just that the Bond, because every time they release a new Bond film, there's talk of the older ones and they replay them. And so it brings it to people's mind a lot, you know. And of course, The Italian Job, and it's iconic. So again, it's on television a lot, and it brings it to people's minds more.
On days like these, on days like these, questi giorni
And of course you wrote this biography about him, the singer's singer. What made you want to actually write a book about him?
Well, because, whenever you spoke to people and said, who's Matt Monro, they would say, oh, yeah, he's the singing bus driver and he did Bond or he did Born Free. And then they'd stop and they didn't know anything more. And I thought that was really dreadful. And also, I wanted people to know the man behind the voice. And I wrote it really for my son, because when I'm no longer here, I wanted him to know that his granddad was more than just a good singer. Yeah. There was a lot more substance to him. And I thought it important that people knew the story.
Absolutely. And that's the point as well. It's the story. It's not about your relationship with him, is it? As some people might assume, it's very much about him.
I actually wrote the book in the third person because a few years earlier I'd read a book by Nancy Sinatra on her dad, and it was Daddy this and Daddy that, and it made me feel a bit icky if I did it in that vein. And I wanted the reader to be immersed in the story, it wasn't important who wrote it. As far as I was concerned. So there are quotes in the book from me, but as I say, I've written it in the third person, which my publisher wasn't happy about at the beginning, but it was the right thing to do, to be honest. I mean, last January, not this year, last year, 10 years of the contract was up and they actually renewed it because it's still selling and it's amazing. I mean, I'm lucky enough to work on the cruise ships and I do talks on my dad's life and music. And every time I take books on, I think, shall I bother? Everybody must have it by now. And yet I sell out every single time. So it's amazing because Dad's been gone 37 years. It's a whole new generation of fans now.
Yeah, absolutely. And did you have to do some research? Because obviously you know a lot more about your father than the average person, but was there still stuff that perhaps you found out along the way that you didn't know?
Yeah, obviously all the years before I was born. I mean, there was 30, sort of, I don't know, quite a lot to 29 years before I was born. So I did 2 years of research and I interviewed people he was in the army with, people he was evacuated with, and got the real gist of what he was like. I mean, obviously my mum was still here at the time, so, and when he was here himself, I'd asked him various questions. It was an eye-opener really, but because of the advent of the internet, I was able to talk to people worldwide, which I wouldn't have had a chance to otherwise. And you wait 4 weeks, 6 weeks for a reply and a letter. I was getting instant replies, and then they would say, well, actually I know this guy and I know this guy, and so it sort of escalated. So I did 2 years worth because there's a lot of celebrity names in the book that gave interviews, but I wanted it to be real. As I say, I didn't want it just to be for me. So if I said to you in the book, oh, this record came out and it was fabulous, people would say, well, she would say that. If I actually put the press cuttings and George Martin's quotes and this one and that one, then it enforced the story rather than, oh, she was just saying that.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned George Martin because there was quite a sort of ongoing relationship between George Martin and your father, wasn't there, making records?
Well, they were best friends. I mean, first of all, Daddy came before the Beatles, you have to realise. And then when George had his success with the Beatles, he didn't need Dad financially or creatively, but he never left him. I mean, they had a fantastic relationship. They loved recording together, and they produced some fabulous music over the years,
And what is your favourite song that your father has ever recorded?
Well, the first time he took me to the recording studio at Abbey Road, and it was a hive of activity. I mean, there was equipment everywhere. There was about 40 musicians tuning up. It was bedlam. And in walked George Martin and tapped what looked like a pencil to me on his on the pedestal, and everything went deathly quiet. And I'm kind of looking around in stunned amazement, and my dad beckoned me over, held my hand and sang Michelle. And that was the recording that was cut and released to disc. And that memory will always stay with me. And then, funny enough, when the book was released, the publishers threw a press party, and unbelievably, George Martin came, and it was held at EMI, and George Martin hadn't walked into EMI in years because of bad blood. And not only did he come, but he brought with him a framed score from that session of Michelle, and he wrote on it, "Your dad would want you to have this," and it's on my wall.
My Michelle.
That's incredible. Did he decide to sing that song because of you then?
Yeah, but he surprised me because he didn't tell me he was going to record it, and I can still see myself standing there holding his hand and him singing it to me, and he did it in one take, and it was incredible. I'll never forget it.
Well, thanks for coming on the show today.
No, thank you for having me.